Today we're focusing on tracheobronchial injury. It's a rare diagnosis, but one that is singularly devastating and demands immediate coordinated action. So let's start with the basics. What exactly is a tracheobronchial injury?
It's physical damage to the trachea or the major bronchi, and it represents a profound physiological threat.
And when you say threat, just how lethal is this condition? Frame that for us, especially what happens before a patient even gets to the hospital.
The numbers are staggering. This injury carries an exceptionally high pre-hospital mortality rate. The estimates are somewhere between 30% and 80%.
Wow, so a huge percentage.
A huge percentage. The reality is that many patients they succumb right away from a catastrophic airway disruption or other trauma before they ever reach the hospital doors.
That really underscores the importance of time. For the patients who do make it to us, what's the incidence we should be thinking about in the trauma bay?
In the hospital, among trauma patients, you're looking at estimates from about 0.5% up to 2%.
Okay.
But what's really telling is that autopsy studies on trauma fatalities show a higher number, somewhere between 2.5% and 3.2%. It just reinforces how many are lost before getting definitive care.
And we can't just think about trauma. We have to consider injuries from our own interventions. What's the rate of iatrogenic or procedure-caused injury?
It's extremely low for routine procedures, something like 0.005% of all endotracheal intubations.
But that's not the whole story.
Not at all. That figure just skyrockets during emergency intubations. The urgency, the poor visualization.
Yeah.
It pushes the rate as high as 15%.
15%? That's a huge jump.
It is, and it tells you everything about the difference between a controlled airway procedure and an emergency one.
Okay, so let's unpack that. Traumatic and iatrogenic injuries. They sound like fundamentally different clinical problems. How do they diverge in practice?
Completely different. A traumatic injury, say from a car accident or a crush injury, is a multi-system problem. You almost always have other serious injuries in 40 to 100% of cases.
So the immediate threats are?
Major hemorrhage and the acute airway disruption itself. You're treating profound shock, multi-system failure, and the airway is just one piece of that very complex puzzle.
Right. And how does that compare to an iatrogenic injury?
It's a total contrast. With an iatrogenic injury from, say, an intubation, other injuries are rare. The threats shift entirely. They're driven by the patient's existing health problems and the progressive air leak.
The air leak being the key problem.
Exactly. That leak can quickly lead to a pneumomediastinum or a tension pneumothorax. It's an isolated injury. The consequences of that leak are profound.
That distinction really guides everything. Let's dig into the traumatic mechanism. How does blunt force physically tear the airway?
There are really three distinct biomechanical ways this happens. The first is what we call increased intratracheal pressure.
An explosive rupture.
Exactly. Imagine a violent chest compression, like from a steering wheel, while the patient's glottis is closed. The internal airway pressure just spikes, it exceeds the elastic limit, and poof, it bursts, usually along the weaker back wall.
So it fails from the inside out. I'm guessing shearing forces are also a major factor in high-speed crashes.
Absolutely. That's the second mechanism. The airway is fixed at the cricoid cartilage up top and the carina down low. High energy deceleration causes everything else to shift. But those points stay put.
Creating immense shear stress.
Right. And it leads to tears right at those anchor points, near the cricoid or the carina.
And what's the third mechanism?
That would be traction forces. Severe front-to-back chest compression forces the chest to widen out sideways. The lungs are attached, so as they pull apart, they generate this incredible tensile force.
And can literally pull a bronchus off.
It can avulse a main bronchus or tear the distal trachea.
Yes. So if we look at those patterns, blunt trauma usually causes transverse or sideways tears within about 2.5 centimeters of the carina.
And that's a stark contrast to iatrogenic injuries. Those are almost always longitudinal up and down tears in the posterior membranous wall from direct mechanical trauma.
Knowing that helps build our suspicion, which has to be extremely high. A misdiagnosis here can be fatal. What are the common signs we need to be looking for?
The most frequent finding is respiratory distress, or dyspnea. You'll see that in 76 to 100% of patients. But the real sign that should trigger immediate suspicion is subcutaneous emphysema.
That crackling feeling under the skin in the neck or face?
Yes. It's present in up to 85% of cases. If you find isolated neck emphysema after blunt trauma or a tough intubation, you have to assume a central airway injury until you prove otherwise.
What about on the chest exam? Pneumothorax has to be high on the list.
It is. It occurs in about 70% of cases. And you also have to watch for hemoptysis or coughing up blood. It's less common but still present in up to a quarter of patients.
Let's talk about the absolute red flag. In the emergency department, what's the single finding that just screams major tracheobronchial injury?
It's a persistent, massive air leak and the lung failing to expand after you've correctly placed a chest tube.
Right.
That's the moment you know. The leak is coming from a high-pressure central source, and it's just overwhelming the chest tube's ability to create negative pressure. That patient needs immediate definitive evaluation.
Okay, so that brings us to the diagnostic pathway. We're in the resuscitation bay. What are the steps?
You always start with a chest x-ray. It's the initial screen. It can show you indirect signs of pneumothorax, air in the mediastinum, things like that.
Well, we can't rely on that alone.
Absolutely not. And this is a key point. The initial chest x-ray is normal in as many as 1 in 5 cases of blunt tracheobronchial injury. A normal film should not reassure you.
So that pushes us directly to a computed tomography scan.
Yes, a CT scan is highly sensitive. It detects over 90% of these blunt injuries. It shows you the tear. But just as importantly in trauma, it identifies associated injuries like to the great vessels or the esophagus, which completely changes the plan.
And even with a high-quality CT scan, we still say flexible bronchoscopy is the gold standard. Why is that direct look so important?
Because it's definitive. It's not indirect evidence. You are directly visualizing the injury.
Okay.
That lets you determine the precise location, the exact lengths, and the depth of the tear. That specific information is absolutely essential for the surgeon. Plus, you can do it right at the bedside, even on an unstable patient, to guide airway management.
Speaking of planning, the cardio classification helps stratify the risk. How does that system categorize the injury?
It moves from minor to catastrophic. A level I injury is the least severe. It's a partial thickness tear, so just mucosa or submucosa. And importantly, there's no mediastinal emphysema.
But once you go full thickness, the stakes go way up.
Way up. Level 2 is a full thickness tear with an air leak. So you see mediastinal or subcutaneous emphysema. But the tissue is still holding together, no herniation.
Then you get to level 3A.
Level 3A, that's a full thickness tear where mediastinal tissue fat, maybe vessels, is actually herniating into the airway.
And that changes the immediate plan.
Immediately. That herniation suggests a much bigger defect. It makes intubation trickier and means conservative management is much less likely to work.
And the worst category, level 3B.
Level 3B is any full thickness tear that's associated with either an esophageal injury or established mediastinitis, an infection in the mediastinum. That diagnosis fundamentally changes the urgency and the complexity of the repair.
Before we get to repair, we have to stabilize. What are the life-saving principles for initial airway control?
The first principle is meticulous control. Any intubation has to be done carefully and preferably over a bronchoscope.
So you can see where you're going.
You see the tear and you guide the tube past it. You do not want to extend that injury because that can be fatal.
What if the tear is in a main bronchus?
Then you use selective mainstem intubation. You intubate the unaffected lung to isolate the injury and maintain oxygenation. And of course, a tube thoracostomy, chest tube, is essential to manage the pneumothorax.
And for the most unstable patients, the ones you can't ventilate?
For them, you might need a bridge therapy. Extracorporeal membrane oxygenation, or ECMO, or even cardiopulmonary bypass might be the only way to support them long enough to get to the operating room for repair.
So once they're stable, the paths diverge. For traumatic injuries, what is the standard of care?
Operative repair. It's the definitive treatment for almost all significant blunt and penetrating traumatic injuries.
But the first priority is?
Always managing associated life-threatening injuries first. Control the bleeding, deal with cardiac tamponade, unless the airway itself is causing the collapse.
And what are the principles for a good surgical repair?
You want minimal debridement, you have to preserve the blood supply, and you aim for a direct, tension-free, end-to-end repair. And if there's a combined airway esophageal injury, it is absolutely essential to cover that repair with a vascularized muscle flap.
Okay. Now, for iatrogenic injuries, there's been a major shift away from surgery.
A huge shift. As we got better with endoscopic techniques, we realized not everyone needs an operation. Conservative management is now ideal for stable, spontaneously breathing patients with small tears, usually 2 centimeters or less, and level 1 or maybe some level 2 injuries.
What does that conservative management look like in practice?
It's all about reducing stress on the injury. So voice rest, cough suppressants, antibiotics, and being very careful with the endotracheal tube cuff, making sure it's positioned distal to the tear. Some places will also apply fibrin sealant through a bronchoscope.
And endoscopic stenting has been a big advance here.
A huge advance. Stenting is now a core treatment, especially for poor surgical candidates. You place a temporary stent, either metal or silicone, and it acts like an internal splint. It seals the leak and lets the tissue heal over 4 to 8 weeks, then you take it out.
So where's the gray zone? A stable patient with a 2.5 centimeter tear. How do you decide between surgery and a stent?
That is the critical decision. A 2.5 centimeter tear is often where we pivot. If the patient is a great surgical candidate, surgery is a definitive one-and-done repair. But if they have significant heart or lung disease, the risk of anesthesia pushes you strongly toward a stent.
But there are still times an iatrogenic injury absolutely requires surgery. When is that?
Surgery is still necessary for large tears, so anything over 4 centimeters. Also for any patient who is rapidly deteriorating, can't be ventilated effectively, or has a level 3B injury with mediastinitis or an esophageal tear. That needs to be opened up and washed out.
Okay, let's turn to prognosis. For trauma patients, what determines their outcome?
For trauma, it's almost always the severity of the associated injuries. To the heart, the great vessels, the brain. Those often overshadow the airway injury itself.
And for iatrogenic injuries?
It's the patient's pre-existing conditions and the severity of the illness that led to the intubation in the first place. But for both, we also have to look at the injury itself. The length of the tear is a significant independent predictor of mortality.
There's a specific cutoff, isn't there?
There is. The data suggests a cutoff of about 4.5 centimeters seems to differentiate higher-risk patients.
Why is that specific length so predictive?
It really comes down to the tension on the repair. Tears longer than 4.5 centimeters are just much harder to close without tension, and that increases the risk of the suture line failing or developing stenosis later.
And what about infection?
The development of mediastinitis is a powerful, independent predictor of mortality from the rupture itself, no matter the cause. Controlling contamination is paramount.
And what long-term issues do survivors face?
The most common is airway stenosis from scar tissue at the repair site. This can lead to recurrent pneumonia or bronchiectasis. And if they had an open thoracotomy, you can see chronic pain and impaired shoulder movement.
There's one last interesting point on mortality, a kind of paradox.
Right, the survival paradox. We see that patients diagnosed more than 24 hours after their injury sometimes have a lower mortality rate. And this isn't because waiting is better, it's pure survival bias.
Meaning they survived because their initial injuries weren't as severe.
Exactly. They didn't have the immediately life-threatening associated injuries that would have led to an earlier diagnosis or death.
Yeah.
So it's a filtered group.
This has been an incredibly detailed roadmap. It seems whether the cause is trauma or a procedure, this injury demands a profoundly high index of suspicion, especially with subcutaneous emphysema or a persistent air leak.
Right, and bronchoscopy remains the key. It's the definitive tool to characterize the injury and guide the right therapy, whether that's aggressive surgery for trauma or a more nuanced, minimally invasive approach for iatrogenic damage.
Optimal outcomes really require a coordinated, multidisciplinary approach. Thoracic surgery, critical care, interventional pulmonology, all working together from the very beginning.